Imagine doing your job to the absolute best of your ability. Like you analyze all the data in front of you, you apply decades of education and experience, and you make this highly educated calculation.
Right.
But because the system you're working in is just so chaotic and complex, you happen to miss one, incredibly subtle detail. And suddenly, because of that one missed detail, you aren't just reprimanded by a boss.
You're facing a $500,000 fine.
Exactly. You're facing years in a federal prison. And now, flip that scenario around for a second. Imagine you're at home, you're asleep in your bed. You are relying on the sophisticated multi-billion-dollar life-saving warning system that is supposed to wake you up in the middle of the night when imminent danger is basically approaching your neighborhood.
Yeah.
But that system fails.
Wow.
It fails completely simply because the specific person whose job it was to look at the data and physically press the warning button was laid off the week before.
Which is a terrifying thought.
It really is. So today we are looking at the intense, high-stakes, and increasingly perilous world of weather forecasting. We're going to explore how the unseen infrastructure that predicts our weather is undergoing these massive, chaotic changes globally. And these changes are affecting absolutely everything, from the safety of your morning commute to the fundamental survival of entire communities.
Yeah, exactly. Because the systems we take for granted, the invisible safety nets of radar, satellites, and human expertise that operate quietly in the background of our lives every single day, they are currently facing unprecedented stress.
Yeah.
We're at this critical breaking point, really, between human safety and administrative reduction.
Welcome to Meteorology Matters, the podcast that dives deep into the science, chaos, and stories behind the weather that shapes our world. This show was created by meteorologist Rob Jones. Now, let's get into today's episode of Meteorology Matters.
Let's do it.
So, setting the stage for what we're looking at today, I want to move away from the usual generic descriptions of, chaotic systems. Based on the massive amount of research we've been reviewing, it feels less like a runaway train and more like this. Imagine trying to paint a manual hyper-realistic, high-definition portrait.
Okay.
But every single day, someone walks into your studio and takes away a different color of paint. They take away your finest brushes. They turn off half the lights in the room.
Wow.
You can still technically paint a picture, but it's getting blurrier, less accurate, and fundamentally more dangerous by the hour. And if the painting isn't perfect, you go to jail. That is the exact reality for global meteorology right now.
That is a hauntingly accurate analogy. The degradation isn't always a sudden collapse, right?
Yeah.
It is a slow, systematic removal of the vital tools and the personnel required to just see the full picture. What we are seeing in the research is not just a localized issue affecting, one specific weather office in one town. It is a systemic global administrative trend where the resources allocated to scientific infrastructure are just drastically shrinking.
Shrinking everywhere.
Everywhere. And before we can even begin to understand the physical fallout of recent catastrophic weather disasters, we first have to look at this global defunding of science. We have to understand the administrative reality that is directly dictating the physical reality on the ground.
Right. So let's start with the United States, which really forms the backbone of global weather data. The research shows that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which we commonly refer to as NOAA, along with the National Weather Service, recently phased plans to lay off 10% of their current workforce.
10%?
10%. We're talking about over 1,000 highly specialized jobs. And on top of that, hundreds of probationary employees were just abruptly fired.
Yes. And before we get into the mechanics of what those individuals actually do, it is essential to provide the context of why this is happening.
Absolutely. And this actually brings us to a very important disclaimer for you, the listener, because this research contains highly politically charged actions by the Trump administration and the Department of Government Efficiency. So we want to be entirely clear here. We are not taking any political sides here. We are not endorsing left-wing or right-wing viewpoints. We are impartially reporting the factual data contained in the research to convey the operational realities happening on the ground.
Exactly. And that operational reality is incredibly stark. When you remove 1,000 skilled workers from an agency like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, you aren't just trimming administrative fat or closing a redundant office somewhere.
Right.
You are removing the literal eyes and ears of the nation's warning system. You're removing the people who physically maintain the radar dishes on those lonely mountaintops. You are removing the technicians who analyze the satellite telemetry in real time.
The actual humans doing the work.
The humans who actually issue the severe thunderstorm and tornado warnings that go directly to your phone.
Wait, let's talk about those probationary employees for a second, because I feel like the term makes them sound like interns getting coffee, right? Like, what does a probationary meteorologist actually do?
Yeah, that is a massive misconception. A probationary employee in this field is typically a highly educated scientist. They often hold a master's degree or a PhD in atmospheric physics or meteorology.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. The probationary period in the National Weather Service, which can last for a couple of years, is fundamentally an intensive on-the-job training phase. It's where they learn the highly specific microclimates of the region they are assigned to.
Like the local quirks of the weather.
Exactly. They are running the models, they are analyzing the data, they're doing the hard daily scientific labor alongside the senior forecasters. So when you abruptly fire hundreds of them, you aren't just saving a salary, you are completely severing the future pipeline of the agency's expertise.
So you are essentially eating your seed corn. You're ensuring that 5 years from now, when the senior forecasters retire, there is absolutely no one qualified to take their place.
Exactly. And the impacts of these kinds of workforce reductions, they're immediate. We don't have to wait 5 years to see the breakdown.
No, we really don't. Because this isn't just an American phenomenon. We looked at data from Argentina, which provides a terrifyingly clear example of cause and effect here. In Argentina, 140 layoffs at their National Meteorological Service are causing actual, physical, immediate disruptions.
Right.
Provincial airports there are having to shut down completely overnight because they simply lack the staff to issue timely weather alerts.
And this perfectly illustrates the invisible nature of meteorological infrastructure. Most people think airports just run on, air traffic controllers and pilots.
Yeah, I mean, that's what you see.
Right. But an airport cannot legally or safely operate without hyper-local, real-time meteorological data.
Think about the last time you flew. When your plane is coming in for a landing, the pilot isn't just looking out the window to see if it's raining. Like, what exactly do they need from the meteorologists?
They need an incredibly precise, up-to-the-minute atmospheric profile of the runway. They need to know the exact wind shear.
Which is what exactly?
It's a sudden change in wind speed or direction over a short distance. Wind shear can literally drop a plane out of the sky during its final approach. It's incredibly dangerous.
Wow.
And they need to know the exact barometric pressure to calibrate their altimeters so the plane knows exactly how far it is from the ground. They need to know the dew point and temperature to understand if ice is going to form on the wings the moment they drop through the cloud deck.
So it's a ton of very specific variables.
A ton. And if the person generating that specific data is no longer employed, the pilot is flying blind. The aviation industry relies entirely on this data. So the airport just has to close. It is a direct, undeniable consequence of defunding.
That is wild, to think that a massive piece of economic infrastructure, like an airport, just halts because a handful of meteorologists lost their jobs. And then we look at Australia, which is a completely paradoxical scenario in the research.
It really is.
Their national science agency, the CSIRO, is persisting with cutting 350 jobs. This brings their total job losses to over 1,150 in just the past 2 years.
And what is fascinating and honestly deeply concerning about the Australian situation is the tension between short-term government budget tightening and the necessity of long-term continuous scientific infrastructure.
But wait, let me push back here because this is where the Australian data gets really confusing to me. The research explicitly notes that the Australian government recently gave their science agency an additional $387.4 million in federal funding.
Yeah, a huge injection.
Yeah, right. So if they just received nearly $400 million, how does it logically make sense that they're still cutting 350 jobs? Is this a restructuring of priorities or just a fundamental misunderstanding of how science actually works and needs to be funded?
It is a really dangerous combination of both, actually. It is a major restructuring of priorities driven by leadership that views scientific departments as interchangeable puzzle pieces. The agency leadership claims these job cuts are, quote, essential strategic research shifts, unquote, necessary for long-term sustainability. So they are taking that massive injection of cash and redirecting it toward things like medical research and pandemic preparedness facilities.
Okay.
So the overall budget of the agency looks fantastic on a spreadsheet, but the specific departments handling atmospheric monitoring, oceanography, and climate science, they're being completely hollowed out to pay for it.
So it's like a hospital deciding to fire all of its leading cardiologists so it can buy more MRI machines for the neurology wing. Sure, the hospital has great new equipment, but the people who knew how to read the most critical heart charts are gone. And patients with heart conditions are suddenly out of luck.
That is a brilliant way to look at it. And the fundamental misunderstanding you mentioned earlier, it comes down to the nature of the data itself. Weather prediction and atmospheric modeling, they are not like building a highway.
Right.
You can pause construction on a highway for a year to save money, leave the bulldozers parked, and then pick up exactly where you left off. But meteorological data requires an unbroken historical series to be accurate.
Explain the mechanics of that. Why does the historical series matter so much for predicting what happens tomorrow? Like, why can't we just look at what the atmosphere is doing today and make a guess?
Because forecasting models are essentially massive pattern recognition engines. They learn from the past. If you want to know how a specific, highly complex weather system will behave as it moves over, say, the Rocky Mountains, the computer models look at millions of data points showing how similar systems behaved under similar conditions in the past.
Okay, that makes sense.
So if you pause data collection, if you fire the scientists who launched the weather balloons or maintain the ocean buoys just to save some budget money this quarter, you create a literal blind spot in the historical record.
A gap in the timeline.
Precisely, a gap. And you cannot just restart it later without fundamentally corrupting the models. The models rely on a continuous flow of data to understand subtle shifts in the climate baseline.
Because the baseline itself is moving.
Exactly. The Earth is getting warmer, ocean currents are shifting.
Right.
If you have a missing year of data, the algorithm cannot accurately track the trajectory of that shift. When you break the chain of data, you fundamentally degrade the mathematical accuracy of all future forecasts. The physical world does not wait for administrators to figure out their budget priorities.
Man. And when that operational capacity drops, the physical world reacts, sometimes with incredibly tragic consequences. Which brings us to the real-world fallout. Because cutting jobs and shutting down offices isn't just a spreadsheet exercise happening in a vacuum. When the alerts stop, things get dangerous incredibly quickly.
Very quickly.
Let's look at the catastrophic flash floods in central Texas over the July 4th weekend in 2025. This was a completely horrific event, and it perfectly illustrates the breakdown we were talking about.
It was a textbook example of compounding systemic failures. To understand it, we really have to look at the geography first. The meteorological dynamics in that part of Texas are incredibly localized and volatile. We are talking about the Guadalupe River Basin.
Right.
Historically, this area is highly prone to flash flooding due to its specific topography.
Yeah, I want you, the listener, to picture this area. It's not a flat plain where water just spreads out slowly. The ground is largely solid limestone, and the slopes of the hills are steep. So when heavy torrential rain falls, it doesn't soak into the earth like it would in a forest.
No, it just runs off immediately.
Exactly. It acts like water hitting a concrete driveway, funneling rapidly down the steep slopes and slamming directly into the riverbed.
And the speed at which that happens, it is difficult for the human mind to process until it is too late. The research notes that during this event, the Guadalupe River more than doubled in height in just 90 minutes.
90 minutes. I mean, think about that. You could be asleep in your bed, perfectly safe, and by the time your alarm goes off an hour and a half later, your entire neighborhood, your entire life is completely underwater.
It's devastating.
And the human toll was devastating. At least 119 people died, with 173 missing. And that included over 30 children. Just entire families swept away.
And this is where we have to look very closely at the alert failures. Why were so many people caught completely off guard by a river doubling in size? We have satellites, we have radar. Why didn't they know?
Yeah, the timeline is absolutely chilling. The National Weather Service did technically issue warnings at 5:34 in the morning, warning of a large and deadly flood wave. But the mayor of Kerrville, Joe Herring, only received a single code-red automated alert on his phone at 6 a.m.
Half an hour later.
He received absolutely no direct phone call, no direct communication from the National Weather Service, and many of the residents sleeping in that area received nothing at all. Like their phones never buzzed. The emergency broadcast system didn't wake them up.
To understand the mechanics of why that communication broke down so completely, we have to look directly at the staffing link. At that specific time, research indicates that 40% of local forecasting offices across the country had severe staffing gaps.
40%.
40%. 30 of those offices completely lacked a chief meteorologist. And the Austin San Antonio office, which is the specific office that covers that exact region of Texas,
Right.
they lacked a staff forecaster and, crucially, a warning coordination meteorologist during this exact event.
Okay, let's unpack that because it sounds like a bureaucratic title, right?
Yeah.
What does a warning coordination meteorologist actually do?
Mhm.
Why is their absence the difference between life and death?
A warning coordination meteorologist is the critical human bridge between the raw atmospheric data on a computer screen and the local emergency managers on the ground. They are the translator.
Okay.
They don't just sit in a dark room and look at a radar screen. They pick up the phone. They have the personal cell phone numbers of the mayors, the local fire chiefs, the county emergency dispatchers.
So they have actual relationships with these people.
No, exactly. When they see a critical situation developing, they bypass the automated systems entirely. They call the mayor and say, Joe, look at this specific radar cell. It is dumping 6 inches of rain over this specific ridge right now. And based on my years of knowledge of this local terrain, that water is going to hit your town in exactly 45 minutes. Do not wait. Sound the sirens right now.
Wow.
It requires highly specific, locally trained human analysis and established relationships.
So it's not just an automated computer algorithm saying, rain equals flood, send text message.
No, absolutely not. Automated systems currently cannot replicate the nuanced understanding of local topography that a veteran human forecaster possesses.
Yeah.
A computer algorithm might look at the rain and issue a broad, generic flash flood warning for an entire county. But the human warning coordination meteorologist knows that the water always pools in a specific valley first, or that a specific low water crossing on Highway 12 floods 10 minutes before anything else. If you remove that human being, if that desk is sitting completely vacant because of a federal hiring freeze or a targeted layoff, the entire chain of communication breaks. It does not matter how good your multi-billion-dollar satellite in space is if the human being responsible for translating that satellite data into a local, actionable warning has been fired.
It really brings it back to the smoke detector analogy for
Yeah.
me. Like, it feels exactly like a city deciding to save money on their municipal budget by going through every public building and removing the batteries from all the smoke detectors.
Yeah.
Sure, the building is slightly cheaper to run, but you have fundamentally eliminated the one specific mechanism that wakes people up when there is an actual fire.
Right.
The building still burns, but now people die in their sleep.
And to make matters worse, the degradation of the physical infrastructure is compounding this loss of human personnel. It is a dual collapse. The research points out that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration actually had to stop releasing weather balloons in certain locations, specifically Albany, New York, and Gray, Maine, purely due to a lack of staff to physically launch them.
Okay, for those who might just picture a kid's birthday balloon floating away, let's get into the mechanics of this. What exactly is a weather balloon doing, and why do we care if they stop launching them in a place like Maine?
Weather balloons are arguably the single most vital operational tool we have for understanding the immediate three-dimensional state of the atmosphere. They aren't just balloons, they carry a sophisticated instrument package called a radiosonde.
A radiosonde.
Yeah. Twice a day, every day, all over the world, meteorologists release these balloons. They travel up through the troposphere and high into the stratosphere, sometimes reaching altitudes of 100,000 feet.
Wow.
And as they rise, the radiosonde is constantly transmitting data back to the ground via radio waves. It measures temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind speed at every single altitude layer.
But wait, we have satellites for that, right? Like, don't satellites do exactly the same thing?
Not at all. Satellites are excellent for looking down at the top of the clouds. They give us a massive top-down, two-dimensional view. But weather balloons give us a vertical slice of the atmosphere.
Oh, I see.
They tell us exactly what the air is doing at 10,000 feet, at 20,000 feet, at 30,000 feet. This is crucial because weather happens in 3 dimensions. To predict a severe thunderstorm, you need to know how the wind is changing direction with height, that wind shear we talked about earlier.
Right.
This radiosonde data is fed directly into the massive supercomputer models every single day. If you stop launching the balloons, you are completely blinding the computer models to the vertical structure of the atmosphere in that region.
And it wasn't just the balloons being grounded either. During severe spring storms across the United States, the research showed that 11 weather radars were down nationwide. That is nearly 10% of the entire American radar fleet offline during peak severe weather season.
Radar is your real-time eyes on the ground. Think of how radar works. A massive dish sends out a pulse of microwave energy. That energy travels through the air, bounces off a raindrop, a hailstone, or even a piece of debris lofted by a tornado, and it comes back to the dish.
Okay.
By measuring the time it takes for the pulse to return, the forecaster knows exactly where the precipitation is, how heavy it is, and how fast it is moving toward a populated area.
So I want you, the listener, to think about the weather app on your phone right now. When you look at your screen and you see that intense red blob moving toward your neighborhood, and you decide to cancel your outdoor barbecue or pull your car into the garage, you are relying entirely on a physical radar dish that might be sitting on a hill 50 miles away. If that dish breaks down and the agency is under a hiring freeze so they don't have an electronics technician to go fix it, your screen just shows clear skies. You would never know the storm was coming until the hail starts breaking your windows.
Yeah.
If 10% of the radars are offline, you have massive geographic blind spots where severe life-threatening storms can develop and approach cities completely undetected.
Exactly. You have degraded data going into the models because the balloons aren't launching. You have blind spots on the ground because the radars are broken. And you have empty desks where the human beings who are supposed to synthesize this mess and warn the public used to sit.
So we have a terrifying situation where the U.S. is systematically degrading its weather infrastructure. But here is where the story expands beyond American borders. You might think that cuts to U.S. agencies only affect Americans. But the atmosphere is a continuous fluid.
Right.
It doesn't stop at a border checkpoint to show a passport. And the entire globe relies heavily on America's meteorological backbone to survive.
This brings us to the massive global ripple effect. Weather prediction is the ultimate international cooperative enterprise. You cannot accurately predict the weather in Sydney, Australia next week without knowing precisely what the atmosphere and the ocean are doing over the Central Pacific Ocean today. The math simply doesn't work without global data points.
And the research highlights Australia's incredibly heavy reliance on U.S. data. Australian meteorologists use data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for both their day-to-day operational weather forecasting and their long-term climate predictions.
They do.
In fact, Australia's primary climate simulator, which is called Access NRI, fundamentally relies on an ocean model called the MOM model. And that MOM model was developed entirely by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Let's explain what that means, because the MOM model, the Modular Ocean Model, is a monumental achievement in human science. It is a foundational piece of extremely complex software code that simulates the physics of the entire global ocean. It calculates how heat moves from the equator to the poles. It calculates how massive deep-water currents flow. It calculates how salinity changes when ice caps melt. The ocean is the battery of the global climate system. It stores and moves heat.
Right.
Australia uses this exact American-built software to run their own national climate projections to predict droughts and agricultural yields. If the U.S. stops updating or maintaining that incredibly complex code because the specific software engineers and physicists at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory were laid off in a budget cut, Australia's entire climate modeling capability begins to stagnate and drift toward inaccuracy.
And it's not just the software they're relying on either. It's the multi-billion-dollar physical hardware in space. The research notes that NOAA satellites provide the critical real-time sea surface temperature observations that are absolutely required to predict an El Niño and La Niña event.
And predicting those events is critical for global survival. Sea surface temperatures are the engine of global weather. An El Niño event, for instance, is a massive warming of the equatorial Pacific Ocean. That relatively small shift in water temperature drastically alters the jet stream and weather patterns globally.
It changes everything.
Everything. It can cause devastating multi-year droughts in Australia, leading to massive bushfires, while simultaneously causing catastrophic heavy rains and flooding in South America. You can only forecast an El Niño by constantly meticulously tracking the temperature of the ocean's surface from space down to fractions of a degree. The U.S. provides that satellite telemetry to the world freely.
We also have the Argo program. This is a fascinating piece of science. It is a global network of roughly 3,600 robotic floats that are constantly recording temperature and salinity in the world's oceans.
Yeah, it's amazing.
The U.S. is a major funder and manager of this program. The research states that disrupting NOAA funding creates massive blind spots in global ocean tracking. Let's explain how these Argo floats actually work, because it's like something out of science fiction.
They are incredible devices. Imagine a robotic cylinder about the size of a human being. These floats don't just sit on the surface. They are programmed to alter their own internal buoyancy by pumping oil into an external bladder.
Okay, so they can dive.
Yes. They drop down to about 2,000 meters over a mile deep into the crushing pressure of the ocean. They drift along with the deep ocean currents for about 10 days, essentially sleeping. Then they change their buoyancy again and slowly rise back to the surface.
Like a submarine.
Exactly. And as they rise, sensors on the float take continuous readings of the temperature and salinity of the water at every depth level. Once they hit the surface, they immediately ping a satellite, transmit all that precious data back to a lab, and then sink back down to do it all over again.
And why is that deep ocean data so critical?
Yeah.
Like, why not just measure the surface?
Because the deep ocean is where the vast majority of the Earth's excess heat is stored. If you want to understand how intense a hurricane might become before it hits a coastline, you need to know how much deep, warm water it has available to feed on.
Ah, I see.
If the funding lapses and these Argo floats aren't replaced when their batteries eventually die, our understanding of the ocean's heat engine begins to erode immediately. If the U.S. goes dark on managing and funding these projects, the entire Southern Hemisphere is essentially flying blind.
Wait, I have to push back here. This is where I start to get confused by the global dynamics. If this data is so vital to survival, if Australia's entire agricultural and climate model relies on it, if Europe relies on it, why can't other highly developed nations just step up?
Oh.
Why can't they just launch their own satellites or build their own ocean models?
Yeah.
Why is everyone leaning so hard on the U.S. taxpayer?
It is a fair question, but it comes down to staggering financial costs and decades of compounding technical expertise. You cannot just replicate this infrastructure overnight. Building and launching a single modern meteorological satellite costs billions of dollars and takes a decade of planning.
A decade.
A decade. Developing a functional, highly accurate global ocean model like MOM takes decades of continuous collaborative work by dozens of highly specialized physicists, mathematicians, and software engineers. The U.S. has been the undisputed global leader in this specific field for over half a century.
So they basically built the foundation everyone else uses.
Right. Other nations have built their entire meteorological infrastructure, their entire academic systems, under the foundational assumption that the U.S. will continue to provide this data as a global public good. If the U.S. suddenly pulls the plug, it would take other countries years, if not decades, to spool up their own space programs and coding labs. And that is a decade of blind spots where natural disasters would hit without warning.
So we have the physical defunding, the layoffs, the failing radars, the sinking robotic floats. We have a physical crisis. But there is a whole second layer to this that is entirely psychological and legal.
Yeah.
The reduction in personnel is running parallel to a massive systemic shift in environmental regulation, and it is changing the very baseline of what scientists are allowed to study, what they're allowed to report, and how they're allowed to talk about it.
We are seeing a concerted, organized effort to rewrite the rules governing environmental impact and data collection across the board.
Right. We looked at deregulation tracking research from the Sabin Center. It details massive, sweeping rollbacks. The EPA is actively relaxing rules on routine flaring at new oil wells. They are removing diesel exhaust fluid sensor requirements for all diesel equipment. Meanwhile, funds that were previously earmarked specifically for offshore wind projects are being explicitly redirected by policymakers to fossil fuel development.
And we see this extending to biological and ecological protections as well.
Yes, the research points out specific, targeted exemptions from the Endangered Species Act designed to rapidly accelerate fossil fuel production in the Gulf of Mexico.
Now, how does this broader regulatory shift actually impact the hard science of meteorology? Because on the surface, oil flaring and weather prediction seem disconnected.
Well, before we answer that, I must reiterate our disclaimer for the listener. Again, we are imparting the data found in this policy tracker impartially. Whether prioritizing fossil fuel production over renewables is the right or wrong economic move for the country is not what we are here to debate.
Right.
We're strictly looking at how these rapid policy shifts directly affect the environmental data that scientists are able to collect and utilize.
And the impact on that data is profound, primarily through the chilling effect it has on internal agency culture. The research highlights that scientists at the EPA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration are engaging in widespread, systemic self-censorship.
Self-censorship.
Yes. They are actively avoiding the phrase climate change in their published research papers, in their internal memos, and in their public communications. They are replacing it with softer, less precise terms like weather extremes.
They are doing this out of genuine fear of political retaliation, or having their departmental funding pulled, or finding themselves on a layoff list. But I have to ask, how does a culture of self-censorship actually impact hard math and science? A severe storm is a severe storm, regardless of what the meteorologist calls it in a press release, right? The data is the data.
Not exactly, because language shapes how we categorize, process, and model data. Let's look at the mechanism of this. If researchers cannot accurately label the root thermodynamic causes of atmospheric changes, their predictive algorithms and models become fundamentally skewed over time.
How so?
Well, imagine trying to diagnose and treat a patient who is showing classic symptoms of a massive heart attack. But hospital management policy dictates that you are only legally allowed to chart it as chest discomfort.
Oh, wow.
You are forced to treat the immediate symptom, maybe giving them a painkiller, but you are ignoring the underlying systemic cause of a blocked artery.
Because naming the actual disease is forbidden.
Exactly. In meteorology, if you are forced to treat every extreme flood, every prolonged heat wave, or every rapidly intensifying hurricane as an isolated freak weather extreme rather than a mathematically linked symptom of a shifting baseline climate, you cannot build accurate long-term predictive models.
You're just connecting dots that aren't allowed to form a picture.
Right. Your long-term forecasts will constantly underestimate the volatility of the atmosphere because you have artificially disconnected the data points from their actual underlying thermodynamic driver. It makes it exponentially harder to forecast long-term weather volatility when the scientists programming the computers are forbidden from naming the variables.
That is incredibly concerning. It's like a butterfly effect of bad data. So you have a scientific workforce that is shrinking due to mass layoffs. The physical infrastructure, the radars and balloons, is literally breaking down. The globe is losing its ocean tracking data backbone. And the few scientists who are left sitting at their desks are afraid to use accurate scientific terminology for fear of losing their jobs. It sounds like an absolute pressure cooker of stress and anxiety.
Which brings us to the human breaking point. The pressure has reached a boiling point globally. And scientists, who are traditionally very reserved, data-driven people, are reacting in unprecedented ways. Some are taking to the streets in sheer desperation, while others are literally being dragged into courtrooms in handcuffs.
Let's talk about the protests first. The research highlights a global movement called Scientist Rebellion. We have NASA climate scientist Peter Kalmus, who literally chained himself to the front doors of a J.P. Morgan Chase building in Los Angeles. He was in tears, pleading, desperate to get the public's attention regarding the mathematical trajectory of the climate.
Yeah.
In Spain, 14 scientists were detained by police after a peaceful civil disobedience protest over emissions. We are not talking about typical political activists here. These are tenured professors, lead researchers, members of the UN panel on climate change. They are risking their entire careers, their pensions, and their physical freedom.
It speaks to a deep, profound psychological desperation within the scientific community. They feel they have exhausted all traditional, polite avenues of communication. They have published the peer-reviewed papers, they have presented at the international conferences, they have briefed the policymakers behind closed doors.
They did everything right.
And yet, the data they are presenting, data showing existential threats to human life, is still being ignored or, as we just discussed, actively suppressed.
But chaining yourself to a bank door is one thing. That's a choice. What happens when the legal system decides to actively punish the scientists for the weather itself? This is where the research gets truly dystopian. It is the absolute criminalization of the forecast.
Yes, this is the most dangerous trend in global science right now. The L'Aquila earthquake case in Italy is the historical watershed moment for this.
Wait, hold on. I need to explain this because it sounds like a movie plot. In 2009, a deadly earthquake struck the town of L'Aquila in Italy. Afterward, 6 seismologists and 1 government official were actually put on trial and sentenced to 6 years in prison for manslaughter.
6 years.
6 years in prison. The prosecution successfully argued that they failed to accurately communicate the risks before the quake, falsely reassuring the public that the situation was normal. How is that even legally possible? An earthquake is a chaotic movement of tectonic plates, not a math equation you can solve with 100% certainty.
It shocked the world. Now, earthquakes are obviously scientifically different from atmospheric weather, but the underlying scientific principle of probabilistic forecasting is exactly the same, and this ruling sent absolute shockwaves through the entire global scientific community.
Let's define that term deeply for the listener. What exactly is probabilistic forecasting, and why does the legal system hate it so much?
Probabilistic forecasting is the acknowledgement that we cannot see the future perfectly. It means that when a meteorologist runs a massive computer simulation of a storm, they don't just run it once. They run it an ensemble of times, say, 50 or 100 times, slightly tweaking the starting variables each time to account for the chaos of the atmosphere.
Okay.
If, out of those 100 simulations, the storm hits a specific city 80 times and misses it 20 times, the forecaster issues an 80% chance of severe weather. That is probabilistic forecasting. But human psychology and the legal system hates probabilities.
Right, they want a yes or no.
Exactly. We want a binary yes or no. The moment you criminalize a forecast, you are demanding a legally binding yes or no from a branch of physics that only speaks in percentages.
And this terrifying legal precedent is spreading directly to meteorology. The research shows that South Africa is currently considering extreme new legislation that would land TV meteorologists in jail for up to 5 years, plus a staggering $630,000 fine simply for getting a forecast wrong.
It's unbelievable.
Saudi Arabia has gone a step further and banned unofficial forecasting entirely, threatening up to 10 years in prison and a $530,000 fine for anyone outside the national center predicting the weather.
This represents a fundamental, profound misunderstanding of what meteorology actually is by the people writing the laws. Meteorology is not a crystal ball. It is the complex science of calculating odds and probabilities based on chaotic, nonlinear atmospheric data. It is never, ever about absolute certainty.
Let's play this out mechanically. If you threaten a scientist with severe jail time for getting it wrong, what actually happens to the forecast?
You completely destroy the utility of the forecast for the public. Let's look at the psychology of the person sitting at the warning desk. If you threaten a forecaster with prison time for a false alarm, meaning they issue a warning for a tornado and the tornado dissipates before it hits the town, they will instinctively start to underforecast.
Right, because they don't want to go to jail for a mistake.
Exactly. They will wait until they have absolute, undeniable visual certainty before issuing the warning. And by the time they have certainty, the tornado's already ripping through the suburbs. The warning will come far too late to save anyone.
They just freeze.
Exactly. Conversely, if you threaten them with prison for missing a storm, meaning a severe storm hits and they didn't warn people strongly enough, like in the Italian earthquake case, they will inevitably overforecast. They will issue severe, blaring alerts to people's cell phones for every single minor rain cloud or dark sky, just to legally cover their own liability.
And what happens then?
The public experiences what we call warning fatigue. If the tornado sirens in your town go off every single afternoon for a month and nothing ever happens, human psychology dictates that you will stop listening to the sirens.
Of course.
When the actual deadly, mile-wide storm arrives, no one takes shelter because they naturally assume it's just another legally mandated false alarm. By criminalizing the forecast, whether you force them to overforecast or underforecast, you guarantee that the public will be significantly less safe.
It is absolute madness. It's exactly like arresting an oncologist because a patient's immune system didn't react to chemotherapy exactly the way the medical textbook said it would. The human body, like the Earth's atmosphere, is a highly complex, dynamic system.
Wow.
There are probabilities, there are best practices, but there are never guarantees. If you put that kind of extreme, life-destroying legal pressure on forecasters, where a missed call due to a broken radar means losing your house, paying $500,000, or going to a federal prison, who is ever going to want this job?
Nobody.
Why would any bright, talented young student spend 8 years studying complex atmospheric physics and fluid dynamics if the end result is massive personal legal liability?
They won't. And we've seen the historical precedent for this kind of scapegoating. The research points out a chilling example from history. In the 1960s, 4 meteorologists in Taiwan were arrested and formally charged with dereliction of duty after failing to accurately predict the exact landfall location of a deadly typhoon. They were used as political scapegoats for a natural disaster. It is a terrifying cycle of blaming the messenger because the message is mathematically complex.
Okay, so the entire global system seems completely broken. The infrastructure is failing, the funding is slashed, the data is censored, and the scientists are terrified of going to jail. It is incredibly bleak. But is there any good news? Like, is there a glimmer of reversal in the data? Because just as the system seems ready to completely snap under the weight of these layoffs and legal threats, the research shows some signs of emergency patching.
The term emergency patching is exactly the right phrase to use here. It is putting a Band-Aid on a structural foundation issue.
The research indicates that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration was just granted a highly specific emergency exemption to the federal hiring freeze. They have been given immediate permission to hire up to 450 people to try and quickly shore up the collapsing National Weather Service.
Wow.
They are desperately, frantically trying to fill critical frontline roles. They are looking for meteorologists, hydrologists to predict river flooding, and electronics technicians to fix those broken radars.
This is a reactive measure to the severe, highly visible, and politically damaging degradation of services we discussed earlier. When airports start shutting down, politicians notice. But the vital question is this frantic hiring spree actually enough to fix the brain drain?
Can you just hire 450 smart people and fix the weather service?
Highly unlikely, at least not in the short or medium term. And the crucial concept here, the mechanism that is constantly overlooked by administrators, is institutional knowledge. When you fire a veteran scientist, someone with 20 or 30 years of experience specifically forecasting weather in a highly complex region like the Pacific Northwest or the Gulf Coast, and then you try to replace them a month later with a brand new hire, you do not instantly replace that capability.
Because it's not a plug-and-play situation.
Okay.
A brain isn't a hard drive you can just copy.
Exactly. A bright, newly minted meteorologist coming fresh out of a top graduate program absolutely knows the advanced math and the atmospheric physics. But they do not know the local microclimates.
Yeah.
It takes years, sometimes a full decade, of daily, meticulous observation to learn how the sea breeze perfectly interacts with a specific mountain range on a highly humid Tuesday afternoon in July to produce a hyper-localized, severe thunderstorm that the computer models completely miss. That subtle, highly localized knowledge exists only in the brain of the veteran forecaster.
And when they're gone.
When you fire them or force them into early retirement to save budget money, that deep knowledge is permanently lost. The new hire has to start completely from scratch, relearning those local patterns through trial and error. And trial and error in meteorology means missed warnings.
Wait, let me get this timeline straight because the whiplash is giving me a headache. So the government fires 800 probationary workers. They force massive early retirements among the senior staff. They throw the entire national weather infrastructure into utter chaos. Radars go down. Weather balloons stop launching. And then, mere weeks or months later, they turn around, realize they broke the machine, grant an emergency exemption, and desperately try to hire 450 people back. Isn't that just violently spinning their wheels? How does an agency ever recover its operational rhythm or its internal culture after that kind of chaotic administrative whiplash?
It is incredibly difficult and in some ways impossible to recover quickly. The morale of the remaining staff is entirely shattered. The continuity of long-term research projects, those models that take decades to build, is completely broken. And perhaps most importantly, the trust between the agency and the public and between the agency and its international partners, like Australia, is severely, perhaps permanently damaged. You simply cannot build or maintain a robust, reliable, life-saving scientific infrastructure on a foundation of constant administrative chaos and whiplash.
It's just staggering when you look at the whole picture, the sheer scale of the disruption to something so fundamentally necessary to human survival.
It is. Meteorology is the ultimate invisible infrastructure of modern human civilization. It's the multi-billion-dollar satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above our heads in the freezing vacuum of space. It's the radar dishes spinning tirelessly on lonely hilltops in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And most importantly, it's the dedicated, highly educated humans staring at glowing screens at 3 in the morning, calculating complex probabilities, picking up the phone, and working tirelessly to keep us safe. It is an incredibly complex, delicately balanced system.
And when you start indiscriminately pulling critical pieces out of that delicately balanced system, whether to save a few dollars on a spreadsheet, or because the hard science is politically inconvenient, or because you want to use the scientists as scapegoats, the system eventually breaks.
Yeah.
And when the weather warning system breaks, people don't just get inconvenienced, people die.
That is the harsh, unavoidable physical reality of what we are facing.
Which brings us to a final, highly provocative thought to leave you with today. With public government agencies, the traditional reliable guardians of global weather data being continuously defunded, hollowed out, and legally threatened into silence, will private commercial weather companies step into the massive void?
It's a huge question.
Are we rapidly heading toward a near future where accurate, life-saving weather alerts are no longer a fundamental public right provided equally to all citizens, but a luxury subscription service? Imagine a world where the wealthy can afford a premium app that gives them a push notification that a tornado is 10 minutes away, allowing them to seek shelter, while everyone else in the same town relies on an underfunded, skeleton crew government office that can only manage to issue a generalized warning after the storm has already destroyed their neighborhood. It is a very real, very possible, and deeply unsettling future if this current global trajectory continues unchecked.
A sobering, vital thought to consider the very next time you casually glance at your weather app.
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up our in-depth analysis for today. Be sure to follow meteorologist Rob Jones on Instagram at Meteorologist. You can also find him on TikTok at TV Meteorologist. And on YouTube, be sure to follow Rob Jones Hurricane, where you can also find the full Meteorology Matters podcast playlist. Don't forget to like, follow, comment, and rate the podcast on your favorite platform. It really helps us out. You've been listening to Meteorology Matters, created by meteorologist Rob Jones. Thanks for listening, and remember, meteorology always matters.